Thank you for coming to this third part of our Tanner Lecture Series with Professor Judith Butler, Maxine Elliot Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and the program Critical Theory at the University of California Berkeley. She is joined by Paul North, Professor of Germanic Languages and Literature here at Yale, and most recently author of The Yield, Kafka's Atheological Reformation. He's also the editor of the review Idiom, Inventing Working Theory at Fordham University Press. We also welcome Jason Stanley, who is the Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale, and his most recent book, among many, is How Propaganda Works. So thank you. We are going to have comments by our two commentators, and then we will open the floor to you all. We're going to have mics on the aisle, so you should get up and get in line after we open the discussion. But before we begin, I wanted to have a moment of remembrance for our colleague and friend, Jeffrey Hartman, who was dear to all of us, and somebody, Judith, that you were close to.
Yes, I was made aware last week that he had passed away, and I remembered very well being an undergraduate at Yale, 76 to 78, when he was giving large lecture classes on Romanticism, and we would all flock there to learn our Wordsworth, and occasionally Paul Damon would come in and say something slightly skeptical, and we would have to look at that and wondered whether there was a potential conflagration. But of course, Jeffrey was open-minded and welcoming of views that were not necessarily ones that he agreed with. But he taught us a slow and thoughtful way of reading that was enormously influential, and so many of my close friends who worked closely with him benefited from his generosity, care, and extraordinary attention. So it's a major loss. It's an historic shift of extraordinary proportions.
Thank you.
So I think I'm going to start. Whoa, that's loud. I feel like I should face you a little bit. Remember, she talked about feminist self-defense classes? So I should be sitting over there.
See, but now you think I'm going to attack you.
No. Talking about violence, I want to take up a challenge that I hear in your marvelous talks, between your two talks. A gauntlet you have thrown down in the spirit of critical theory, which should call on us not only to think through the consistency of a theory, but to imagine ourselves carrying it out under a real description of the world in historically and politically contingent conditions. Part of what I hear in your two texts is the critical challenge to make the theory action, but a strong part is also the theoretical challenge to be consistent. So I want to ask a few things about the theoretical side. Consistency is difficult with regard to the critical theoretical task of understanding violence and possibly eradicating it, because as you have described it, it involves considering the same events under two optics. On one hand, under a moral optic, on the other hand, under a social optic. These are my translations of your marvelous phrases, unwilled proximity and unmanageable dependency. You put these forward together not as a solution, but as a problem, as I see it, theoretically hard to reconcile, for sure, but also as a trial for listeners, an ordeal that we have to go through in thinking the problem of violence through. For you say that the condition for action under a real description of the world in contingent circumstances, the condition for any action against violence, is acting on both of these theoretical descriptions of the human being at once, unwilled proximity and unmanageable dependency. And these are obviously in high tension or even in contradiction with one another. I want to take up the challenge to consider these two conditions together, unwilled proximity and unmanageable dependency. That is also a possible suspension of the difference between the moral and the social optics. This is an immense gift you are giving us, but it also threatens to ruin the justification for some distinctions between some academic disciplines. When I consider them together in one optic, immediately I'm confronted with another problem, one about the basic unit both of moral and social interpretations, which I want to phrase this way. I must be a self, I cannot be a self. I must be a self, I cannot be a self. This is another way of phrasing the contradiction as conflicting injunctions. You could say that's a moral way of phrasing it. But this relies on another type of claim that on one hand, everyone can be a self, independent and fully to itself, and no one can be a self, as ultimately dependent and crossed by others, and crossed by alien concerns not in concert with the self and its wishes. That would be the social way of describing this. Now I want to make another interpretation or translation, and here I want to ask you specifically to respond. The injunction, I must be a self, I can't be a self, and the social claim or ontological claim, no one can be a self, everyone can be a self, also can be seen as a matter of violence. The question is, can it also be seen as a matter of violence? In your analysis of social institutions and your analysis of ethical situations between people and within the psyche, the basic unit common to both in this, which you could call a self, I would assume violence has a foothold right there in the basic unit. So one question first about vocabulary. Would you agree that violence, in the American lexicon at least, is related to violation? Mm-hmm. And violation implies a sphere that should not and could possibly find a way not to be violated. Violation implies this basic unit that can be violated, is violable, and also thus has as its basic position to resist violation. And both of these also imply an ideal, I think, which is inviolability. This is one thing I hear violence to mean listening to your talks. Unwilled proximity and unmanageable dependency depend, in the theoretical sense of dependence, on a potentially viable and thus basically resistant and maybe even ideally untouchable unit, though maybe it's never really so. Under this interpretation, the social optic, the bond, the contract, no one can be a self, which says the basic social unit is not independent, also says the basic social unit is already violated, prima facie violated. It was a bastion, and it's now been invaded. Under the same interpretation, the moral optic, everyone can be a self, argues that it must be able to be inviolate. Does this interpretation also imply then that we are nothing without violation attempts and defense attempts? Something in the psychoanalytic framework seems to imply this. I want to ask one further question about just the moral optic, the question of the inviolate or the unviolated, which we have to imagine, I think, by means of a metric of violability. And specifically, I want to ask about this term, metric. You use it to describe the social field under moral conditions. That is, you propose a sort of measure of the relative violability of moral subjects to each other in the largest group, and you want this measure to be equal, an equal amount of violability or an equal amount of inviolability. Equally inviolable or equally viable to a 0 degree or to a very low degree. I take you to be asking how, taking ourselves as already mutually violated, a practice could arise that acts as though we were mutually not to be violated, crossed, penetrated, disrupted, though only in things basic to life, things that provide a minimum of stability, biological things, but also psychological and institutional things, and only not to be violated in a way that would not diminish the basic stability. There's some basic portion of inviolability in the self, despite its being crossed by other selves and other wishes. This reminds me of a theological structure. So I want to ask you about the term that I feel describes the inviolate aspect. It's a field of terms, actually, from your talks that came up many times in different forms: worth, value, preservation, safeguarding, and finally, this really marvelous and thought-provoking term that you've been working on for a long time, grievability. So I wonder how you would respond to a final question and an example. The question is this a re-sacralization of life? This seems to be implied in the concept of worth and value, but also in the actions we've been considering, preserving and safeguarding these two actions. Do these belong to what we would call a treasure trove picture of life, a sacred substance calculated maybe even quantitatively in order to keep it from diminishment? The able and grievable I take as not meaning possible in an epistemological or ontological sense, but in a sense of worth it, or worthy of mourning. What is grievable is worth grieving because its loss can be counted as a loss of some portion of valuable stuff. I suppose you're going to disagree with me on that, but I hear this in my own interpretation, my own framework. This has to be true in any case when you use the terms value, because value is never an absolute but always a comparative phenomenon, a metric. It can be diminished to very little or even zeroed out, and likewise it can be augmented or fortified or protected with guards. A murderer's value is considered zero when compared to the value of the murdered, for which the murderer compensates with her own life. A side question that comes from Georg Simmel's account of punishment in his theory of money, in the concept of worth, is already the concept of substitutability. This is Simmel's point. In a medieval milieu that Simmel doesn't precisely specify, the king cannot be substituted for. His is the absolute value. All other lives can be exchanged for one another, body for body, soul for soul, part for part. And because they can be exchanged, they can also substitute other forms of value for this, like money. You can see the theological structure here. Except for God, everyone else has value, and it makes them all substitutable such that you could take a life for a life, or lock up an actor for violating the free action of another. So that was the question, and now I want to give you an example and see how you respond. The example is punishment. You argued very strongly, and I agree deeply and support this gesture with everything that I can, that there's a continuum of violence, that it's not to be restricted to bodily blows or the sphere of physical interactions. Is there also not something different from violence in punishment? Or maybe we could say, perhaps punishment is the true sphere of violence as a diminishment of what should have remained unpenetrated, sanctified, unscathed. Safeguarding is a morally good reaction to the value theory of life. But punishment, according to Simmel, and in some formulations to Nietzsche too, punishment takes for granted the treasure trove theory of the moral self, the ultimate substitutability of self for self, life for life. Is it right to see punishment as a result of the equal distribution of value of human life in inviolate units? Is it right to see punishment as a result of the equality of grievability?
Okay. Maybe I should respond first, so we hold this together, because otherwise we might have quite an intensity.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Okay, up further. All good? Thank you.
Sound good.
All right, excellent. Well, first of all, thank you, Paul. And I guess I'm just going to say I'm sorry we're not talking about Kafka.
Yeah.
Which would really.
I'm always talking about Kafka.
You know, I sort of am too. So maybe that will come back around. But I'm glad to be talking about this. Let me start by saying, yes, to some degree, I try to make theory action. Maybe that's true. I'm not sure it's exactly true. I'm not sure that theory translates immediately into action or is itself an action. I think of whatever the kind of theoretical work that I do, I think of it as trying, not always successfully, but trying to experiment with the possible. So opening up a horizon of possibility that I understand to have been foreclosed by popular discourse or academic discourse or public policy and such. So by doing that, one is always a little bit impractical, and one is accused of being impractical, which is the sign for me that I am not accepting the restrictions on thought that currently guide us in identifying what is practical. I think sometimes the impractical position is precisely the one that has to be held so that we don't accept the restricted horizon of thinking. Like talking about nonviolence. Okay, laugh at me, right? Talking about radical equality in the Middle East. Ha, ha, ha. I mean, all the things that one gets, as it were, derided for because one apparently doesn't have a sense of realpolitik is what one has to, I think, actually put out there, even if it seems incommensurable with reality. So, Stuart Hall always talked about how theory and practice work in some tension with one another. And so, if anything, I see or I participate in practices, and then perhaps I register them at a theoretical level, and then try to press the description for possibilities that get beyond the more limiting horizon. So there is a relation to action for sure, and some of my work on performativity has been trying to understand modes of action that are important to the constitution of gender or subjectivity or indeed assembly. So, it's there, but I'm not sure exactly if I would accept the idea that I seek to make theory action. I think consistency is important, but I think that I'm also willing to work with positions that are not fully commensurable with one another, and to allow that incommensurability to stand as a kind of ongoing challenge. So if it doesn't all fit together, if I have to shift lenses or start again, or maybe, in the middle of a paper, take another point of departure in order to reapproach the problem from another angle, it's because I'm imagining with Benjamin, perhaps, that there's a constellation here that can't be approached through a single lens, or that it needs a series of experimental forays in order to glimpse different aspects of what's going on. I do care about consistency. There's no doubt about it, but I don't always assume that it's ready to hand. Now, you suggested, I thought interestingly, that I propose that we consider the same events under two different optics, one of them moral and one of them social. But then it seems that you also affirmed that it turns out that those two fields or those two optics are not fully separable from one another. And I suppose my effort has been to show that even if we start with a relatively straightforward mode of moral reasoning, where I ask myself as a first person, what ought I to do in cases where I'm presented with the possibility of doing violence, it turns out that how I think about this self and how I think about others to whom I may or may not do violence presupposes certain kinds of demographic assumptions. So already there, in the most kind of solitary moment of moral reasoning, where it's just it's me, it's my reasoning, it's this potential action, and it's some set of others. If we dig a bit deeper, we see that that we're asking that question about certain kinds of people, or we're imagining a certain kind of person, and even the I, who is isolated in its moral reflection, has already effectively taken itself apart from others, and is not has become individuated in the course of that form of moral reasoning, which is something we might call into question, because maybe another approach would be better if this I understood itself as connected to a we. Maybe there would be moral resources for handling the problem of nonviolence that are not available to me if I start with the first person alone. So it's true that I am trying to, without answering the question of whether or not I should do violence, I am asking what the question posed in that way presupposes, and I'm finding that the moral question presupposes a set of social presumptions and even demographic ones. And that one way to characterize those demographic presumptions is that there are schemes by which the value of life is unequally distributed, and some of them are according to race, or some of them are according to ethnicity or gender, and we could talk about that at length. So it is true that I'm suspending, I don't know if I'm suspending the difference between the moral and the social. I'm not taking it as a necessary disciplinary framework within which I must work. But, I have tenure. I'm also quite happily, excuse me, an interdisciplinary scholar. So I have greater license than some people who live in more narrow ideas of what a discipline should be. I don't worry about being expelled from a discipline. It's no longer possible. But it's a it's a privileged position in academic life. It's a privileged position, even though people say, "Oh, don't you wish you were in philosophy?" It's like, well, no, not. Oh, I'm good. But I like being in comp lit. I like being in comp lit in part because one gets to read, and also one gets to put things together that don't necessarily belong together and see what happens when you can do that. So there's something about comparative work that is allows me to shift frames and actually takes that to be part of our so-called method. It's like, yes. Okay. I also like its multilingualism for other reasons that I could talk about. But let's go back to your question. What's the basic unit? Well, I think it is an open question what the basic unit is. And one of the points of my lecture was to suggest that this I with which I begin, this subjective point of view, is presupposing a social world and also linked with other living creatures, even the ones about whom I'm contemplating or deliberating morally. And that means that I have to think of this I not so much as a unit, just as a discrete unit, but as a set of differentiated relationships. So I'm afraid I can't find the unit, and maybe I want to say that trying to find the unit, the basic unit of analysis, misrepresents the field of relationality that I think is so important to foreground, and which constitutes something like this resource that I think is available for moral and political thinking when we start thinking about inequality and we start thinking about exclusion and issues like that. Now, I was interested in your discussion about the self, and I liked your remark, I must be a self, I cannot be a self. In the moment of self-defense, yes, it's true. I must be this self that I preserve. I cannot just be this self. I am also connected to others. How do I live that bind? I think that's a good way of putting it. I wonder if we have to distinguish between self and subject. When Foucault says that a subject has to be constituted as a rights-bearing subject before it can have a right to life. He's suggesting that something, we could call it a self or a person, we could use a placeholder term, has to be constituted as a subject. A subject is recognized as a subject, it is subjected to law, it's recognizable within law. Not every self is a subject, and we can't substitute the one for the other, since we need a way of thinking about subjectivation, becoming a subject, and we need a way of thinking about desubjectification, the loss of the status of the subject. So to the degree that the term subject is a kind of status that's acquired or even formed or deconstituted, it's a bit different from self. What difference does that make? Well, I think it makes a difference if one is trying to become, in some sense, a subject recognized by law or a subject who bears rights of certain kinds. And one of the problems Foucault has is that when he starts talking about the management of populations and what populations do in relationship to being managed in the way they are, he suddenly says the concept of the subject's not working here. We have a different problem. We need another vocabulary. And he doesn't take it up. He doesn't pursue it. But it's a very interesting moment where it would seem that the demographic turn, as it were, calls the idea of the subject into question, and calls for maybe another way of thinking collectivity, or another way of thinking network, or another way of thinking a population that is bound by language or land or ethnicity or other terms like that, without necessarily becoming a collective subject, right? So that's a kind of open question, and I think it is an important one. Maybe the subject can't do all the work we want, and maybe there's some good reasons for that. Your experiment with thinking about violence as related to violation and in turn inviolability is very interesting, and of course it's not a path that I pursue here, but it's one that you pursue, which makes me wonder, A, why don't I pursue it? And B, what would happen if I did? I think maybe one reason I don't pursue it is that it does tend to produce a metaphysics of the core, some sacred core, which you're pointing out. But that's not my way of describing violence so much. And if you think about it, at least in these lectures, there's a question of the abandonment of a population, the abandonment of the refugees, or the abandonment of people who are in dire need of health care and unable to get it. They're not literally pierced by any instrument. They're not violated in the sense of having been physically opened up in the sense that we think about rape, although some of them may well be. At least rape itself would not be the model for all kinds of violence. It's one kind of violence that I think does get called violation, but I'm not sure, and importantly so, but I'm not sure it can become the model for every kind of violence that we're thinking about, especially if we're trying to think about the unequal grievability of life. It's one instance, but it wouldn't, for me, qualify as a kind of ontology such that I believe in a sacred core. Now, that's not to say that I'm not interested in sacralizing gestures. Maybe I am. That doesn't worry me. Maybe it should. I don't care. It's another one of these things like, oh, she's sacralizing. Oh, okay.
They weren't going to take you in the divinity school anyway.
Well, it's okay. I actually liked going to the divinity school here. I went a lot. I learned my Wittgenstein in the divinity school. Okay, but here, this is what I think. I think that the ethical bond that I'm working on may well have something. I don't know if we want to say it's sacralized, but I want to say that whatever it is that binds us to others in a way that is not necessarily of our choice is in a way given to us to honor, quite apart from any contract we may or may not have entered into. So that might be a covenant. That might be some other kind of ethical bond which is filled with rage, very precarious, very fragile, and obligatory. And if that has a religious sense to it, that's okay with me. If I'm sacralizing, that's okay with me. I don't know. It doesn't seem to disqualify my view if that were the case. I think there's another perhaps sacralizing moment which has to do with the right to be grieved and the demand for public mourning. And maybe that also is a way of retrospectively conferring the status of a life on a person, no matter what we may have thought of that person or what the content of the life might be. The this is a life, this was a life, is a public or social confirmation and a marking of a loss, and that those who are unmarked or remain unmarked are indeed, in some sense, violated, according to Antigone. But of course, it's the laws of kinship that get violated at that moment, at least in that play. But maybe that is there. Maybe that's there. I don't think it's so much an inviolable center as an obligatory bond. And so part of my understanding of social interdependency is also related to an idea of ethical obligation among people, not so much conceived of as individual, but as bound to one another, both, I suppose, ontologically and ethically. The Zimmel, I'll just say this, that I think Zimmel is always working within the model of money. So when he talks about value and he talks about the substitutability of value, he's thinking already within what Marx would call exchange value. I think that I'm probably looking for a different idea of substitutability, not one that that says that one life, the value of this life is equal to the value of another life because both lives are the same, right? Assuming a kind of uniformity. It's more a question of value, the value of life being an effect of a valuation, what gets distilled at the end of a process of valuation. So maybe a more Nietzschean idea than a Zimmel idea. We have a process of valuing that produces the effect of values at the end, and systematic ways of devaluing and systematic ways of valuing tend to produce a differential metric. And I use metric maybe a little ironically, since there would obviously be no way to calculate, since I'm against calculation. But I do want to use it in part ironically because we are subject to so many metrics. And metric itself has resonances that are not necessarily mathematical. I mean, they are to some degree, but they can have other, it can be understood in yet other ways. Your question about punishment is a really good one. I think that I do focus on punishment as a form of violence. I'm not sure I'm always right to do that. Because punishment is already taking someone as a subject before the law, and there are other forms of less sovereign power that do not take subjects before the law, or that are excluded from the law, or that are abandoned abandoned to the extra-legal regime of the current refugee world under no jurisdiction. I think obviously Agamben is somebody who has thought quite a lot about what that particular position is. So we might understand the abandonment of the refugees at the borders as a kind of punishment, and maybe so, but I think it's not just that, and maybe that doesn't describe the violence of the situation in a way that's quite right. But there's so much more to be said about punishment, so maybe we'll continue that.
Thank you.
Yeah, that could bring us to Kafka for sure.
Yeah.
So I have these remarks on my Yale webpage under teaching. So if you go to my teaching, like Jason Stanley, and then the teaching icon, it's at the bottom, Tanner Thomas. So most philosophers struggle with pursuing highly abstract philosophical concerns in a world riven with concrete injustice. Well, some philosophers do. But Butler is one of the great philosophers of our time. Her work provides hope that one can square a particularly vexing circle. She is remarkably inspiring, and it's amazing to be able to discuss these central philosophical topics with her. I want to begin with one of what I regard as the foundational texts of American political philosophy, Frederick Douglass's 1852 address, what to the slave is the 4th of July. In it, Douglas writes, "Must I undertake to prove that the slave is a man? The point is conceded already. Nobody doubts it. The slaveholders themselves acknowledge it in the enactment of laws for their government. They acknowledge it when they punish disobedience on the part of the slave. There are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia which, if committed by a black man, no matter how ignorant he be, subject a white man to the like punishment, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of the same crimes will subject a white man to the like punishment. What is this but the acknowledgement that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being? The manhood of the slave is conceded." Douglas is here describing what in Butler's terms are, quote, "the racial phantasms that inform the demographic valuations of who is grievable," unquote. Secondly, via his descriptions of the laws of the state of Virginia, he is describing the practice of what he calls the practice of violence. These laws, in Butler's words, quote, "function not only as a potential defense, but as the effective moralization of murder," unquote. Is the solution to replace these laws by other laws, more just laws? Butler writes, "I have no doubt that better law is obligatory," unquote. But Butler rejects that the solution will be found entirely in a set of perfectly just laws. Even if the laws are perfectly just, if the underlying society has a malformed ethic, an ethic of violence, the laws will be interpreted or applied in a way that undermines the justness of these laws. Direct you to her comments about judges interpreting the law. Veshla Weaver, Michelle Alexander, and Naomi Murakawa argue that mass incarceration is due to the racist application of a post-civil rights colorblind legal framework. The result of a racist application of apparently colorblind laws is a racist legal system. But the laws themselves are colorblind and so appear to give full moral justification to their application. As Charles Mills says, the liberal framework like this forces the person who suffers from it to be accused of being a racist for saying, wait, they're being applied unfairly, and they're accused of playing the race card. It follows that dissent or rebellion against the legal framework will appear to be violent. And so the very people who suffer from the racist application of these laws will be deemed to be the ones engaged in unjust racist violence, as they object to supposedly colorblind laws. As Butler points out, in such a situation, critique comes to be regarded as a form of extra-legal violence. If there is a pervasive racist application of colorblind law, then those who challenge it, quote, "however nonviolent," unquote, will be regarded as engaging in an extra-legal form of violence. I think that propaganda in liberal democracy regularly takes the form of good liberal ideals together with bad application, the result of which runs counter to those very ideals. The result, in Butler's apt phrase, which I'm going to steal, is, in future work, is a paranoid logic. What's Butler's solution? Butler's solution is to change the underlying practice, to adopt a practice of nonviolence. A practice of nonviolence allows us to see common social bonds. Laws may stay the same, but outcomes differ due to the recognition of common social bonds, and this happens often, even in American history. Such practices allow us to see beyond cognitive biases due to group identities and recognize a common social bond. And it is the lack of just such a bond that we began with Douglas decrying. As Lisa Rivera has argued, this occurred in Goodridge versus Massachusetts Department of Public Health, 2003, which legalized same-sex marriage without changing any laws. People just saw, oh, there's equality. There is a practice that allows us to see a common social bond. That does not diminish the importance of law. Indeed, as Butler emphasizes, the practice involves simultaneously reflecting on law. As she writes, the ethical and political practice of nonviolence requires an opposition to biopolitical forms of racism and war logics that rely on phantasmagoric inversions that occlude the binding and interdependent character of the social bond. And propaganda, as I think of it, are these phantasmagoric inversions. In the terms of Patricia Hill Collins, one aspect of this is gaining the critical consciousness to unpack hegemonic ideologies, unquote. She writes in Black Feminist Thought. And as Collins emphasizes, and as Professor Butler emphasized again here just now, it also involves the development of new epistemological resources, that opens up new possibilities. Those of you who know about prison abolition and Angela Davis's work on prison abolition, she argues that we need to answer the question, well, what do we do what replaces the prison? We deny that question. We replace the system by new possibilities. Now, a pressing question is whether it is possible to describe a practice that is fully liberatory that itself is not subject to inversions in the way that Butler critiques. And that's, so as Rousseau's general will notoriously is, most sadly and absurdly in Heidegger's Rechtsrede, where he demands that you see the general will in the will of der Führer, and Trump demands that you see the general will in the will of, in his success. So can Butler do this? How is Butler going to do this? And she's very sensitive to this because this is, now the practice, I think this connects with what is a second move in her lectures in the discussion of exceptions. The practice of nonviolence is not free of exceptions. As she writes, a nonviolent practice may well include a prohibition against killing, but cannot be reducible to that prohibition. But the exceptions cannot be stated as principles, because these then would be further laws which in turn could be misapplied. Now, if you look at the thing on the web, I walk you through, I argue that Butler's argument is an application of the logic of Lewis Carroll's famous regress. It's the rule following problem. So now it's got to be a practice. It can't just be another law, because then it's going to be misapplied. So if we think of the practice of recognizing a social bond, even recognizing it when it's manipulated, as a kind of perception, as seeing others as grievable, then there is no need to think of the capacity to see others as sharing your social, sharing a social role as describable by a general rule, like, oh, they're human, or oh, they have reason, or oh, they're civilized, or they share the social contract. So seeing others as grievable is a perceptual metaphor. This is a view that John McDowell sources in Aristotle. We depend on a capacity to see certain things, a capacity that cannot be encoded in a law, though perhaps one could describe it, as McDowell himself suggests, as a generic rule with exceptions. That way, one can avoid misapplication. I see the great virtues of Butler's account, at least as I understand it, but I would like to conclude my comments with where I began, with Frederick Douglass's address. Douglass asks to be viewed, in his view, as a moral, intellectual, and responsible being. My colleague Stephen Darwall described this as a demand for equal respect, which in his Kantian framework, rather than the highly formalistic one criticized in the beginning of lecture one, in his second personal framework is a demand for accountability. It would clarify my understanding of Butler's account if she could help us see how seeing Douglass as grievable, in the sense she has developed in these lectures, answers Douglass's demand to be seen as a moral, intellectual, and responsible human being. Social change for the good happens. All of us face these questions, how they do. I thank Professor Butler for doing the hard work of laying the foundations for a novel account.
Great, thank you, Jason. Wonderful. Thank you. I'm not going to be able to have immediate responses to everything, but let's turn to Frederick Douglass and this passage, which, of course, I have taught as well. What to the Slave is the 4th of July. It's a brilliant essay, rhetorically and argumentatively. And although the paragraph begins, must I undertake to prove that the slave is a man, suggesting that he doesn't have to prove that, or why should it be his burden to prove that the slave is a man. He actually goes on then to make an argument which proves it. But he makes the argument by showing that the laws that punish slaves presuppose that the slave is a man, otherwise the punishment wouldn't make sense at all. So But of course, anyone who opens with this rhetorical move, must I undertake to prove that the slave is a man, is already in discourse, already in reason, already calling into question the usefulness of a certain kind of proof for an issue such as this. If a slave can disobey, then the slave is not the pure tool of the slave owner. If a slave should be punished much more harshly, and indeed become eligible for punishment by death for crimes that white people are not, this is also a way of acknowledging that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being. In other words, it is precisely to deconstitute that human and to deracinate that human, which is the aim of the punishment. And if there were no human, the punishment would make no sense, because a non-human cannot be reduced to non-human status. It's a tautology. So it's the deprivation of the humanity understood here as manhood, perhaps problematically, but we don't have to go there just yet. I guess the place grievability comes into this particular paragraph maybe relates back to what Paul was saying about punishment, punishment by death, right? The disobedience of various kinds will result in the punishment by death of the slave. The life is taken away. The life is robbed of its life, and the life is cut short. That life is not a life that is to be preserved, right? It is a life that has lost any claim to be preserved, and the only way it would have a claim to be preserved is through manifesting obedience in a consistent way. So it is a man. It's a man who has not been absolutely obedient in the way that a slave should be. It's a disobedient man whose life will not be preserved by virtue of his disobedience. Now, it seems that we can understand the death penalty, especially in the context of slavery, as a refusal to safeguard that life and to understand it as a potentially grievable life. Now, when I say that a life is potentially grievable, I'm actually saying a couple of different things. It would be grieved if it were lost, but also in its present living status, it ought to be safeguarded and preserved so that it can live out a life, and those lives that are not grievable are not given the infrastructural conditions or the legal conditions or the economic conditions to persist, much less to thrive. So we make assumptions about grievability when we insist on health care. We make assumptions about grievability when we want a population to be properly fed and properly housed. These are lives that ought to be preserved. And there's an understanding of mortality in that valuation, and there's an acknowledgement that it would be best if mortality were suspended, or if this life were able to live out a term that was not prematurely cut short by social, legal, economic reasons. So I think being entitled to such a life, to live without slavery, to live out a life to whatever its term might be, and not have it cut short through those kinds of social, political, or economic, or legal means, is precisely to have a life that is grievable, that is valuable, that should live, that should be given the proper conditions to live. And it's those conditions of life that are being taken away in this instance through the death penalty, which establishes the slave as ungrievable, a life that ought not to be a life, and that ought not to be mourned or understood as as lost at some very basic level. I don't know if that answers you, but you can respond. This should be more of a conversation anyway.
I'll just say one very quick thing.
Yes.
I think Douglas is saying that the very structure of the laws makes his perspective makes whites not view him as a reason-giving person to whom they're accountable. Which is, you're focusing on the death penalty, and you do have a great explanation of that. But the very structure of the laws represents his perspective as not someone who's a reason giver.
Well, yes, that's the point.
I'm going very liberal.
The inequality of the laws, if you think about what the legal systems were under slavery and how many different so-called infractions called the death penalty down upon slaves, we're talking about a legal system that is structured through profound inequality. So we don't have the case that the laws are just, they're just badly applied. These are bad laws. No. Yeah, these are bad laws. These are laws that are not only rooted in racial inequality, that are reproducing racial inequality, and precisely the demographic distinction between those who should be allowed to live and those who should not.
But the fact of those laws doesn't recognize his equality as having an equal perspective, like an equal say, an equal, but I'll stop there.
No, I mean, that's true that those laws do not recognize Frederick Douglass, who in 1852 is still a slave, right? He hasn't bought his way out yet. He had to go lecturing in Europe in order to get the money he needed to buy his freedom, okay? So hopefully he was paid for this gig. It's true. It's absolutely right, but he's a fugitive, actually, slave. But that's right. Those laws don't recognize it, but those laws presuppose the necessity of having to institute social inequality so that we can make distinctions between sorts of humans on racist grounds. Right, and in that, and to the very, because it has to be instituted, it presupposes that it's not natural, right? It's not already the case. It's not necessarily the case. It has to be instituted and reproduced through the legal system. And in that sense, Douglas's so-called manhood or humanhood or equal point of view is presupposed. It has to be deconstituted again and again. Okay. I appreciate the remarks you've made here. Maybe we could talk about mass incarceration. It seems to me that Angela Davis's argument is that mass incarceration is not so much the result of race-blind laws that are applied. Yes, but I'm going to try to use hers to offer a different perspective. Which is that for Davis, at least, slavery didn't really come to an end, and that slavery was a way of suspending rights of citizenship, of managing rights of citizenship, of demographically allocating rights of citizenship, and as soon as slaves emerged as free, they were, of course, allowed to live on land only by paying enormous debts, which they could not pay, which landed them in debtor prisons, which then continued slavery through imprisonment. And she would say that that has been a continuous movement throughout American history, and that the massive numbers of black and brown people in U.S. prisons it's not a singular continuum, but it continues that same mode of power that regulates who will and will not have access to citizenship. So I think the slavery imprisonment nexus is an important one to continue to consider in this way. Yeah. Okay. Maybe we open it up, or
let's open it up.
Yeah.
We've got microphones. Please identify yourself as you come to the microphone. because this is being recorded and we want your question to be attached to your person, your subjecthood.
This question is not about state violence. It is about your discussion of the social bond. You spoke in
Could you say your name?
Hi, my name is Katie Toth. I'm not an academic, I'm a journalist. And I just had a question for you. You have both written for lay people and written academic work. True. And your academic work has been criticized in the past for not being more accessible. So when you're talking about the social bond, I'm just wondering, what obligation do you think that the academic has to making that work accessible? And where do you think the line is of creating that accessibility and not dumbing down what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think difficult work or work that contains difficult language is sometimes difficult because it's trying to disrupt our usual ways of seeing things, give us a different kind of perspective, and challenge us to think again about how we put the world together and how we put language together. I'm surprised by how many people who are not academics are willing to read academic work that is hard. And I sometimes get upset that a kind of general reading public is presumed to be one that could never read what it reads. I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of books Gayatri Spivak has sold, but that work, which is considered to be among the most difficult to read in the world, is a source of extraordinary importance and inspiration to many, many people. So there's one question. On the other hand, it is important to shift registers depending where we are and how we're speaking and what we want to do with our speech. And I think many of us do that. We teach a certain way, we write a certain way, we sometimes give public talks or make public statements that are in another kind of language, or talk to our neighbors or other people in ways that do involve translations of various kinds. I'm not sure one sort of language is the true language. I think of myself as shifting registers a lot, and that my language is that whole panorama. I thought it was probably okay here at Yale to do some hard work.
Hello, hi. Richard Prum in Ecology and Evolution.
Yes.
You've mentioned or hinted at many times that you were interested in entertaining or talking about non-humans, animals.
Yes.
And I'm interested in both concepts of subjecthood, grievability, violence in animals. And there seems to be sort of two contexts. One, domesticated, or animals that have both proximity and dependency, and then those animals that are in some ways similar selves, but living totally free from us, but impacted by our efforts or our activities indirectly, like global warming, habitat change, habitat use, without particular interaction.
Yeah.
So anything you have would be fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I just have a few things to say about it. First of all, I think that very often debates about humans and animals assume that they also are completely distinct, but the human is a human animal. So there's a chiasmic relationship between the human animal and other kinds of animals. And then we have to think about sorts of animals and their relationship to other living creatures that may not be animals, and other living processes. So I think, in fact, a much fuller account of all this would have to go back to the notion of life and living creatures and living processes, and resituate some of what I'm doing here in relationship to inequalities among humans in a broader notion of life. And the other reason I have to do that is because I sure sound like I'm pro-life. And pro-life has, of course, been a term that's been taken over by the anti-abortion movement. And I would like for the left to take back life. And not in a kind of vitalism, or not in a sense that life is immediacy, but because life is organized and mediated in some complex ways. I also continue to follow, and have for many years, Donna Haraway's work, and interested in what she has to say about companion species and modes of interdependency there. What is that ethical relationality? But also perhaps the idea that animals, non-human animals, are in part totally free from us. I'm not sure they are ever totally free from us anymore. And I'm not sure we are ever totally free from them. I think we probably have to think about that as another perhaps unchosen relationship, sometimes proximate, sometimes distant, that implies its own ethical obligations as well. Much more to be said on that topic, which I haven't yet done.
Hi, my name is Maya Nitas, and thank you so much for taking us on this journey through psychoanalysis and philosophy to talk about questions that are so urgently contemporary, I think. And so my question is just about the relationship that I think has come up in these lectures, but also in the discussion. So the differences and connections between the notions of a rule, a norm, and prohibition. And I'm not sure if I understand it exactly correctly, but I take it that what you were saying is that a law has more punitive power behind it and is associated with that, whereas a norm may have a relation to a kind of hopeful and futural universal, perhaps. But I'm not sure where rule and prohibition would map onto that matrix. Thanks.
Okay, well, maybe, thank you, Maya. Well, I think maybe there are two different contexts, and this may take us back to Jason's question as well about principles and practices. In the second lecture, I was working briefly with Foucault's distinction between sovereign power and biopower, and sovereign power does tend to work through laws and legal regimes, but so too does biopower. I mean, public policy or legal regulations regarding healthcare or migration would probably also be biopower. So I don't think that law has a different kind of punitive power. We might understand punishment as belonging to as a prerogative of law, for sure, but there are other kinds of norms that govern the distinction between grievable and ungrievable lives that can end up with populations being fully abandoned, or populations being fully destitute and let to die. So being let to die by a set of normative structures is no less hideous or no less destructive or no less violent than being sentenced to death in a court of law. They're different modes of violence, one of which the court of law would be an instance of sovereign power according to Foucault, but the other form of being let to die that may be a result of law, or it may be a convergence of law and norms that are actively and fatally distinguishing among populations to be protected and preserved and those not to be. I do think that when we think about nonviolence, sometimes we understand it as a simple prohibition, thou shalt not kill. And I think nonviolence has to be broader than the prohibition. It has to be an ethos, and it has to be a practice. So the single prohibition is not enough to qualify. We have to figure out how and when to apply it, and how to embody it, and how to enact it, and how to live in a world in which it might be recognized and shared as a practice. So it has to have a status as a social practice. So for me, a principled opposition to nonviolence, understood as a matter of individual conscience or moral resolution, is not quite the same as the practice. In fact, you could hold to that principle intellectually and have absolutely no idea how to apply it or how to live it or how to enact it. Or you could enact it and realize, oh, my practice seems to contain a principle in it. I didn't realize that my practice of nonviolence had a principle in it, right?
That's the Lewis Carroll.
That's the Lewis Carroll. My principle is embedded in my practice. I didn't realize until later that, oh, I was acting according to a principle. I thought it was just my practice. But the question of how principles get embedded in practices and how they're different from maybe formal principles is an interesting one. And I think for me, what's interesting about relocating nonviolence as a practice is that it's also historical, it's elaborated in relationship to context, and it has to be knowing about the social, economic, and political world in which it's operating, because you could have a position of moral purity, I don't kill, as you're living in a world and even affirming a world in which many deaths are happening by virtue of systems of radical inequality. So it seems to me that if your own actions are not also taking into account those other forms of inequality, that it doesn't make sense in terms of a more robust politics. So for me, individual principled actions always have to ask about those demographic presuppositions and take them into account, so we can have nonviolence coupled with a commitment to equality. And I think it doesn't work without the two. And what form these commitments take is somewhat complicated. Nonviolence has to be a practice, and thinking about the inequality of the grievable, or these demographic inequalities I've been talking about, that actually involves a pretty elaborate description and analysis of the contemporary world and how inequality is organized. Otherwise, we're not able to act nonviolently in a meaningful way, or to act nonviolently without presupposing and reproducing systems of inequality we don't necessarily want to affirm.
Hi, I'm Matt Schaefer, a PhD student in political theory. Following your lecture yesterday, a friend of mine suggested to me that in analyzing a case like the killing of Garner in New York, it might be important to attend not only to the way in which his death was seen by police officers as ungrievable, but also to the way in which his claims that he couldn't breathe might have been seen as sort of irrelevant or as untrue. And so I wanted to ask about the relation.
Can you say that again? Irrelevant or
untrue. Or untrue. Is not believable. So I wanted to ask about the relationship between grievability and credibility, which seems also to have a kind of racially structured schema that bodies get fitted into, and which also seems to be unevenly distributed, and which also seems to be very relevant to questions about sexual violence, in addition to racialized violence.
Mm-hmm. Well, either his claim that he was not able to breathe was understood to be true, and that seemed like a good thing to those who wished him dead and wanted him fully strangled, or they didn't take his claims to be true because he is a liar or wanted to get out of the chokehold, or it was somehow seen as strategic. I'm not sure. I don't know if we have a way of knowing that. But if it was one or the other case, then they are, of course, different. There are different fantasies about what that speech act was doing or what it might have meant. And both of them, I think, are could be understood as racial phantasms of a certain kind. Credibility, of course, when we think about sexual violence and the question of credibility, I presume you're saying when a woman says no, does she really mean no, or is that a tease or a seduction or something like that? Yes, there are ways of denying the Speech Act or undercutting it as a way of undercutting the autonomy of the person and of the statement of that will. That's for sure. I guess I might just take this opportunity to say something else about sexual violence, which I didn't talk about, but surely could have, and that has to do with with what I found in my recent travels to Latin America, where the movement against femicide, or the killing of women, which has expanded in some places to be a movement against feminicidio, which is not just the killing of women, but the killing of trans women as well, has produced an important movement, and it's one that not only documents the extraordinary number of women killed in places like Honduras or Brazil or Argentina and Mexico, but trans women as well. And one of the problems that movement has is that they can't easily go to police to say this is a crime, because their crime is not accepted as a crime. It's not recognized as a crime. Or the police will harass them, or the police will attack them again. So they can't turn to the law for help. And even when in Brazil they did pass a law against femicide, would not pass it for feminicidio, including transgendered women. That's not okay. But when they did pass that law, the law was unenforceable, because the law needs the police to enforce it, and the police were, I'm not going to mess with this, because men have that right, or they've traditionally had that right, and women have it coming, and if they were disobedient, they deserved it. But that movement has been very, very interesting to me, because it had to find extra legal ways of providing support and resistance when the law was actually complicit with the sexually violent crime, and with violent crimes in general against women and trans women. So, and that made me think that it might be important to think about an extra legal form of resistance and an extrajudicial killing. There's two different kinds of things. We talk about extrajudicial and extra-legal, but these are extra-legal forms of resistance. They are still trying to make differences in law, and they do very often appeal to international human rights organizations to make those interventions, effectively trying to shame local legal regimes. But of course, it's only in very specific cases in the Inter-American Court where their findings can actually be binding. They can be binding. They're not completely powerless, but it's only under certain conditions. So that seems to be another example where all of these lives are, in some sense, ungrievable, to the degree that there is no public recognition that these were criminal losses and that these women died, trans women included, died through violent crime. The statistics are hard to find. They're barely marked by the statistics. There have to be special teams that go out and get the statistics in order to mark the death at all. But without marking the death and without naming the crime, you can't even begin the process of a legal or political reform. So there's something there that relates to what I'm trying to say about becoming grievable, and only becoming grievable under certain public conditions.
Thank you. My name is Mojik Tyler. I'm a freshman here at Yale. And I was interested in the confluence of the portions of the speech that are talking about, for instance, the sexual violence. The last question actually set it up fairly well, and the connection between grievability and credibility. So when we talk about societies which have institutionalized in them sort of forms of sort of normalized forms of, for instance, sexual violence and of sort of gendered violence, of sort of police brutality, things like this, this is often connected in necessity to uphold these claims with a sort of lack of credibility in the form of a lack of credibility of discourse. That those who are affected by this are so often denied the sort of place as a rational agent in these systems. And so when someone such as Eric Garner is killed, you often see protests that have a noticeably violent nature in American cities across the country, and sort of which gives a question to the practice, the radical practice of nonviolence. Clearly, these protests do not seek to set up a culture of violence in the countries in which they're in, and yet they view this violence as a necessity to be able to claim their right to a place in discourse and to claim a justification of their sort of place as grievable. When one who is not given the right to discourse as a rational actor and is also coupled with that not seen as grievable, perhaps that exists because of their lack of grievability, or perhaps their lack of grievability exists because of it, how does one nonviolently claim access to discourse and to grievability if one is denied both?
Mm-hmm. It's a complex question, and a good set of questions, I think, clustered in your complex question. So thank you. I think of course, there have been massive protests, as you know, in the last few years following each and every documented death of a black man, generally by police, less so for black women. And we could ask why it is the media doesn't foreground that, and why there has to be an entire policy institute that collects that information and publishes it, and what their access is to the media. So there's, that's what Kimberly Crenshaw is working on now, and it's a really important issue. But of course, some of the protest does take the form of mourning, and some of it is about mourning and rage at the same time, mourning and rage together in public protest. Some of that rage becomes violent and some of it does not. And I would say that there are internal battles at almost every one of these massive demonstrations about whether or not violence against property or violence against persons is a justifiable way of reacting to an unjustifiable murder, a patently unjustifiable murder. And I think that those are open debates. And I suppose I take a position in favor of nonviolence, even in the midst of rage, of bitter, horrible rage, because and not just for the strategic reason that, that will get reported as the violent act, and then we'll be seen as irrational, and we will be discounted, or not that kind of an issue. I mean, that's something to think about tactically, but that's not the basic reason why. I think it's very hard to make a credible case against violence through violence. Even though I understand, and this is part of, this is part of anti-colonial, the anti-colonial movements of the last 7 decades, and there are debates about the difference between the violence of the colonized or the violence of the subjugated and the violence of the state. But I think we're living in a time right now where state-based violence and non-state-based violence are equally terrifying and horrible, and that we can no longer do the reverse of what Benjamin has described, whereby we say state violence is the bad form, and the violence against the state is the good form. I think it's not so simple. I think violence does take place not only through biopolitical means that are not always state-centered, but we also have to be thinking more broadly about the map of violence and negotiating outside of the framework where it's just the state violence being resisted by non-state actors who are part of a social movement seeking to bring down the state or to change the state in some fundamental way. I think that's an important framework. It sometimes works. It's not always working now. It's not always working now. So I think we need a broader map, and there's no reason, in my view, to object to forms of state violence with any more than forms of hideous non-state violence that takes away populations, innocent populations, at a moment's notice. Civilian damage, people in Brussels, people in Ankara, people in Beirut, gone in a moment in the context of war. So I think what we have to really ask is whether we want to be operating in a war logic, which makes us think about which position of violence we need to be in, or whether we want to actually be profoundly against war and think about what the radical critique of war would be, and whether that would allow us a different way of thinking about our alternatives and what nonviolent practices might be that actually shed a critical light on the war logic itself.
I think we have time for one more question. I think, yeah.
Hi, my name's Tom Connolly. I'm assistant professor in the French department.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you a question about the term grievability. I wanted to ask a question about the term grievability,
yes,
which I presume is a neologism. So when you create a neologism, you operate something like violence on language as we know it in order to do that.
I don't know.
Just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you came to the term, whether its etymology in the Latin gravis, meaning weighty or heavy, is important, why you didn't go for something related to the verb to mourn, which has a much stronger relationship to notions of memory, and ultimately how you might suggest translating that term into other languages, into French, for example, or German.
It's terrible in French. Well, first of all, I don't think I made up this word. I mean, that's very funny. If I did, it was certainly by accident. You don't sit down and go, what word shall I make up? It's not deliberate. But I think I started asking whether lives were grievable. And then I started thinking, well, maybe there's a quality of grievability that we could think about as characterizing populations more generally. And that helped me to understand why in certain war situations, certain populations were grieved massively and others were actually understood as legitimate targets and could remain nameless. And so that's something I've been dealing with, I guess, since 9/11, not quite understanding how it all works in that way. But I mean, if it does do violence to language, I guess I should say I'm sorry. But some people have said they kind of like it, but maybe it hurts your ears. Maybe you're from the UK. No, I mean, I'm sorry. I'm just, I don't know what to say. I mean, I do think that sometimes we need to strain language in some awkward ways in order to grasp something that we don't have an easy way of describing otherwise. The problem in French, of course, is, people talk about the capacité de pleurer, which really, it's really the capacity to cry, and that doesn't really work. Deuil I like, yes, but I'm willing to have translators in French work with this in a way that makes it happen. I'm not strict. And if somebody had, even in English, someone had another way of putting it, great. It's not like a copyright or patent or something. And I believe in translation more than I believe in almost anything else, so.
Judith, could you take one more question?
Yes.
There was a young man who, yes, I hate to cut things off.
My name is Simon. I'm a sophomore in the humanities department. I was just wondering, you mentioned earlier that you try to stay away from positing something like a sacred core and instead are inclined toward framing the discussion in terms of an ethical bond between people.
Yes?
And so I wondered, how does that, to me it seems that that could imply that the act of violence injures victim and perpetrator equally, and I wonder if there's, especially when you said that only some kinds of violence are conceptualized as violation, like rape, and I wonder if you would say that there is that there's a way in which or something other than that bond that does mean that violence is victimizes one side more than the other, or that violence is inherently a sort of reciprocal action.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me say this, that I think rape is understood in several different ways. And one way is to understand it as a violation of a core, but not everybody understands rape that way. And there are other ways of understanding it legally and even ethically as an act of violence without necessarily subscribing to that particular idea of a sacred core. The reason I have a problem with sacred core is because I have a problem with core. And I've had that since my early work on gender, because there were ego psychologists who kept talking about the core of the person, the core of the ego, and that there was even a gender core that was inside. Robert Stoller said this, and that we express that in some way, and that it governs our gender presentation in the world. And at that time, at least, I was very much arguing against that, suggesting that gender gets built over time and through social means and practices. I now have had to go back to see that some people really do like that idea of having a gender core. So I'm no longer publicly arguing against it, because I need to listen more to what people have to say about that. Because they're not Robert Stoller, they're somebody else. Okay, but here's the deal. I do think that to understand violence that I do to another as being done to myself as well is only possible if I understand my life as intimately connected to that other life. And that means I've already elaborated a social conception of interdependency or interlinkage that would make it understandable that I am not just hurting the other, but hurting myself, and in fact, something about the living character of relationality. So I think there's a way to make this argument through a longer engagement with the work of Emmanuel Levinas, where I both accept some of what he has to say about my primary ethical relationship to the other, but where I also insist that we have to understand those relations as reciprocal rather than asymmetrical. And that puts me in a different position from Levinas. But that would take much more time, and it's already noon.
And so I think we'll just end with a big thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, gentlemen.